Hotline Miami was made by Jonathan Soderstrom with art by Dennis Whedon that was made in Game Maker. A two-man team, chunky pixel visuals, and an eclectic mixtape of a soundtrack gives it the earmarks of an indie game. This isn't exactly a good thing, but it's not a bad thing. It's always nice though when a developer cares so much about their game that they're willing to patch pirated versions of it just so people can enjoy it. If there's one thing everyone seems to like about Hotline Miami, it's the music. As I previously described, it's something like a mixtape, which I guess is appropriate for a game based in the 80s. The soundtrack features several artists whose tunes all have a very distinct sound that fit perfectly for the game's setting. Just stop and look out your window. Reagan's not in office anymore. The Berlin Wall came down. The Soviet threat has crumbled. And the Second Cold War is coming to an end. The threat lives on only in the paranoid, and the future is being driven by a patriotic consumerism. Party until only the neon lights aren't bleeding together. And call in sick to work when you're so far out of your head, you can't remember what happened. If it wasn't clear, the music sets the mood right, and whether they be high or low energy, fit the mood of most levels. The only time I found myself sick of a song was when I spent longer than I would have liked in a level. As an indie game, Hotline Miami utilizes a retro look that lots of indie developers seem so keen to use. Its use is aided by the period setting, so it becomes more appropriate and less of a throwback or cop-out. One thing that kept me from fully accepting this art style was the character portraits. A number of portraits feel crude and strangely drawn, not out of choice of style, but compared to the masks, which aim for a level of realism. A few of the more important characters in the game even bear similarities between portraits, likely a result of a little corner cutting. If we consider that even in old games of that time, character portraits usually went one of a few ways: realistic renderings with limited color palettes, or strong graphic styles that seemed actualized and distinct. I don't get either of those from the character portraits of Hotline Miami. I need to talk about these two together. Hotline Miami tries to create a game experience where not just the story is symbolic, but the gameplay is as well. It leaves space for interpretation and doesn't give you answers. Or at least, it's more satisfying when it doesn't. So as I evaluate the story, I'll evaluate the gameplay as well. Hotline Miami reminds me a good bit of the old Grand Theft Auto games, not just in its visuals, but for its top-down camera and violence-driven gameplay. The first large segment of the game, you play as a blonde unnamed young man who most fans refer to as Jacket. Or maybe the last quarter of the game, you play as another unnamed character that fans have taken to calling Helmet, because unlike Jacket, who wears animal masks, he only wears his motorbike helmet. As either one, the player fights their way through a crowded building full of thugs, usually trying to find someone at the end of the carnage that they're supposed to kill. The game's dynamic relies heavily on trial and error, which can get annoyingly repetitive, but is something of a problem since a good system dynamics challenge will be closely related to the player's developing skill. While one of the characters has the ability to lessen this, there's still a few curveballs, such as enemy AI that occasionally acts weird or unreliably ignores or becomes alert. There's also two segments in the game that disrupt the game's flow, but I'll touch more on that in a bit since it's part of the experience which relates to the story. Jacket and Helmet differ in their methods and motives. The game design was successful in that as I played as them, I could feel myself thinking like them. As Jacket, I used any and everything I could get my hands on to brutally maim and slaughter the people in my way. Why? Because someone on the phone told him to. As Jacket, that's all the motivation you need. The two segments I previously mentioned that caused some trouble are experienced as Jacket. During one of the hits, a seemingly infinite number of SWAT officers stormed the building with automatic weapons, body armor, and an aggressive AI that's even looser than one of the unusual mobsters. This effectively forces the player into a stealth situation with little introduction and makes it even worse when the trial and error dynamic hits you like a brick to the face. I managed to get through that segment after a few deaths by smacking a few cops onto their back and sprinting for the exit. If you didn't find that troublesome, then maybe you won't be annoyed when you have to do it again with tighter enemy AI who have wider vision cones, while you have no weapons and the inability to go too far without nursing a head wound. The hospital segment and this stealth mechanic are horribly implemented and can go from annoying to tedious. Unfortunately, I think it was an intentional choice by Soderstrom. It seems that this is a change in narrative, temporarily neutering Jacket and by association, chastising the player for going on the rampage. It's a bit of a wash though, since Jacket goes back to normal once he gets to his apartment and his possible development seems to be forgotten. I appreciate this brave thinking of using the gameplay to create a certain mindset for the narrative, but I think there's a problem when doing this purposely preys on something that's not been taught and can kill the player's interest. Whether it's a series of gut-wrenching trials or a despicable protagonist, the audience still has to maintain the interest of seeing the story through. I don't think the game did this, and I only pushed through that level because I didn't want to make the review unless I had played the full game. As Helmet though, I found myself much more at home, and closer to who I normally am. Let me just say by the way, Helmet is a pretty cool guy. He's technologically savvy, probably does some DJing, and is kind of sharp. Helmet gets the same anonymous threatening phone calls that Jacket did, but he doesn't just take someone's orders. Instead, he looks for who's threatening him. As Helmet, the player cannot wear masks that give him the abilities that Jacket had, or use other weapons. He only uses a heavy cleaver, and a set number of those can be thrown. Playing as Helmet were the finger snaps that brought me back to my senses after playing as Jacket. Without the masks, the game can get harder, but ideally the time spent playing up until now has honed your abilities to work with these limitations. Soderstrom does something strange in telling the story of our heroes. He not only overlaps them, but makes them contradictory. It calls into question whether it's all an abstract matter focused on style and purposely open for interpretation, or if one of the two was working his way through some sort of delusion. For the most part, it seems Helmet is the real hero of the game. In Jacket's story, the interludes take on bizarre imagery. 3 figures in masks speak to him in riddles. Clerks and merchants with the same face seem to know him and give him things for free. He even starts to see corpses, and it all culminates with him getting shot in the head, apparently alleviating him of these haunting visions. So if Jacket isn't a reliable narrator, and his story contradicts with Helmet's, why do we care? Was it real before he gets shot in the head? Was it real after he wakes up in the hospital? With Helmet's story given an actual explanation, it seems to devalue Jacket's narrative and makes him feel like an afterthought to Helmet's grounded view of 1989 Miami. Jacket is an obvious homage to Ryan Gosling's character of the driver from Drive. Similar setting, similar sense of style, both seem to don masks to transform their blank demeanor as they slip deeper into brutality. With the matter of a contradicting story and a blatant throwback, I can't help but feel that Jacket really was an afterthought to Helmet. It leaves me with questions, and not in a good way. As previously mentioned, Helmet's ending quite plainly states that it's all an effort by 2 characters who feel suspiciously like self-inserts of Soderstrom and Whedon that are using these phone calls to send hits against the Russian mafia in Miami. It tears down the fourth wall some, but gives something of a plausible conclusion that throws away the uncertainty and mystery of what the player experiences as Jacket. So to wrap it all up, Hotline Miami has a killer soundtrack, an art style that most people will feel works, decent but somewhat flawed gameplay, and a strangely executed story. It doesn't have the careful execution of a big title. Despite all that, most players will likely enjoy and get their money's worth, if not more, from Hotline Miami. It's also a nice attempt at something different.